Welcome back to the Foundry. You know, it's been a while since my super clean Gen 10 F150 has made an appearance on the channel. So why is it up in the shop now? We're about to find out. This is my 2002 F150 shop truck that I bought new 22 years ago. And while I haven't really cut it any slack over the years, as is evidenced by some of the character it's developed, it's still a really clean truck inside and out. But perhaps most importantly, this has been a very reliable truck. And for the first 10 or more years of its life, it was my primary driver. But as with all of us, Father Time spares no one. And this Gen 10 F150 is no exception. In this video, we're going to be focused on the front end. It has developed a strange noise, and I've crawled all around it looking for anything obvious, sway bar bushings. I've bounced the truck up and down trying to replicate the noise. I can't get it to do it when I'm not driving it. It doesn't seem to matter if you're driving straight or turning, and it's not a sound that I can easily describe to you. It's not a squeak, it's not a rattle, it's somewhere in between. It's very weird. And so what I'm going to try to do today is replicate that sound on camera so that you can hear it. I've got a couple of errands to run, so I thought I'd put a couple miles on this thing and see if we can't get it to make the noise we're looking at. And what's weird about this noise is it doesn't do it right out of the gate. You have to drive it for a few miles. And even then, it's intermittent. So this is one of them deals where I'm glad I'm not having to rely on a mechanic, because I guarantee you, you take it to the mechanic, it won't never make the noise. So, and trying to get it on camera is going to be a hat trick. But I figured it was worth a shot just to give you some indication of what I'm dealing with. So what I've done so far is all the normal things. I jacked the truck up, I put a pry bar under the wheel before I pulled the wheel off. I checked for any kind of slack. Very, very, very little in the lower ball joint. In fact, I thought it was wheel bearing at first, but I put my fingers around the ball joint while I moved the wheel, and that seems to be, I'm talking minuscule slack. In fact, if there was no noise, I wouldn't even concern myself with it. I went on to inspect the sway bar bushings and end links. Those are all good. I did have a slight squeak from my upper control arm bushings. The upper control arms, ball joint, and bushings are fairly new, I'd say within the last 5,000 miles, but they were squeaking. I lubricated them with some silicone lubricant, solved that. Did not solve the major noise. I checked the shock. It was replaced the same time the A-arm was. I did both sides. And the spring saddles, I don't see anything wrong there. Wheel bearings, I popped the dust cap off the wheel bearing. The grease in there looks like the day I put it in there. There's no slack in the rotor. So it's one of those things. Oh, I checked the lower control arm bushings as well. There's no slack in them. But that tiny little bit of slack in that lower ball joint is really, I've checked tie rods, I've checked all kinds of stuff. That's really the only thing I can find. And as bad as I hate to do it, I think I'm going to go ahead and pull the knuckle so I can properly inspect that lower ball joint. Even though it doesn't have a ton of slack in it, it could be dry. Although a dry ball joint typically makes the most noise in turns, which this truck isn't doing. So this whole thing's got me baffled. I'm just going to dig in and see what we can find. There are so many things I would rather be doing right now. So much so, I would gladly pay a mechanic. I'd just hand him the key and say, call me when it's done. But I know full and well if I were to do that, it never would make the noise for him. He would look over the front end just like I did and say there's nothing wrong with it. So I'm not even going to waste my time with that. Plus I've got this nice big shop and I've got enough tools to overhaul a nuclear reactor. So hopefully I am capable enough to get it done. Don't you love how Ford makes these to where you can't grease them? I got a grease needle I can sometimes slip under there, and I'll give it a shot before I put it back together. What is going on in there? This rotor should just slide right off. Well, that's a new one on me. We'll have to inspect this bearing. So it was definitely accumulating some rust right there. Put new seals in these hubs when I did the upper control arm. Now, like I said, that was like probably 5,000 miles ago, but that was also like 4 years ago. This truck doesn't get driven very much. The bearing feels okay, but I just don't have a lot of confidence in that grease. I've got some much higher quality grease now. I remember when I did this job, I used some older grease that I had. It didn't look bad, but it was old. So I think what I'm going to do is probably go ahead and repack these bearings in an attempt to salvage this seal, because it's in good shape. I'm going to put this nut back on the spindle. I'm trying not to get grease all over the brake surface. We're going to slide this up on here. Put this nut back on the spindle. Do that number. I don't like what I'm seeing with these wheel bearings. It was clearly rusted on this inner race to the spindle. And this grease, for no more miles than it's on it, it really does not look good. I've never been a big fan of this grease. The only reason I use it, or have used it in the past, is I have so much of it. I got a 5-gallon bucket of the stuff, but it doesn't have good additives in it. It's actually an aircraft grease, and aircraft lubricants are usually subpar compared to, well, subpar in automotive applications, because you got to think about it. In the air, like the oil and things like that, they don't have dust up there and dirt and things of that nature. I had a friend that ran the aircraft oil, engine oil one time. It's all he had. Somehow ended up with some. And he wiped a lobe off of his camshaft. It didn't have the proper additives in it. So I popped the knuckle off, and I didn't have the camera on apparently when I did the lower one, but it comes off just like the top one. You take your nut loose and then grab you a drifter. On the lower one, you might need like the 2 or 3 pound variety if it's really stubborn, and you want to smack the knuckle, not the control arm. Smack the knuckle and it'll just fall off of there if you give it a good hit. So I was prepared to say I've got good news and bad news, but yeah, really, I mean, it looks like I'm just getting bad news here. The ball joint doesn't really have any slack in it, but it is getting a little floppy. I don't know. Let me get you down there. It doesn't really feel like it's got any slack in any direction. But given that it's got 130,000 miles on it and 22 years of service, and the fact that I just recently had to replace the uppers, I guess I'm going to put ball joints in it. Doggone it. I really didn't want to have to mess with that. And further, I got to looking up here at the control arm bushing, the lower control arm bushing. I don't know if it's going to come across on the camera, but there's a little bit of a gap between the frame and the bushing itself. That the frame is kind of clean. It's almost as if that control arm is moving, and that's not what I wanted to see. I really don't want to do this. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and turn loose of the sway bar and unbolt the shock here so that I can drop that control arm and get it clear of the spring to where I can grab hold of it and really flex it around and make sure it doesn't have any slack in it. I found that channel locks work a little better than an 8mm end wrench to hold the shaft of that shock. And then you just put you a gear wrench on this thing, and it's a lot easier. It also helps to put a jack under the control arm so that shock is not taking the brunt of the full force of that spring pushing out against it, making it harder for you to turn that nut up there. Well, I can officially say I've got good news and bad news. But the good part about the good news is it outweighs the bad news. My lower control arm bushings appear to be in good shape. They don't make any noise here. There's no slack. I put a pry bar up in and around both of them and moved it every which way, and there's no slack, and it's not squeaking and cracking. So that's good. I really didn't want to have to mess with pressing in new bushings. What was that? The good news or the bad news? That was the good news. Okay. The bad news is, in and amongst all of this, I still haven't found anything that just sticks out and says, this is the noise. This is the part that's worn out. Nothing is just totally shot. It's a strange one. You know, I just don't usually get really simple, easy to diagnose issues. You know, it makes me tough. Keeps me on my toes. But so anyway, it's getting late here, so I'm going to wait until the morning. I might have time this evening to run up there to the parts store right before they close. I'm going to grab some bearing seals and ball joints and probably reconvene in the morning. All right, the parts store had everything I needed in stock. Spent a sack load of money and got a sack load of parts. So I'm getting ready to pull the lower ball joint. Got the ball joint press out here. So let's dig back into this thing. Easy peasy. Well, that might set the record as the easiest ball joint replacement I've ever done. It went very well. The new ball joint does have a grease fitting, which is awesome. I would rather it be clocked like that, but that's just where it tightened up. I can still get to it with a grease gun, I believe, when I turn the wheel to the passenger side. So now I'm just going to clean all this up, lubricate everything, and sling it back together. Then we'll pack our new wheel bearings and set the preload. Got all this back together, cleaned the spindle with some emery cloth, gave it a light coat of grease to hopefully avoid what took place when I was taking that rotor off and that bearing was stuck onto the spindle. There's kind of a felt dust seal back here. It felt good, so I gave it a light coat of grease, put all this on, used the grease needle to slide up under the lip of the tie rod end boot as well as the upper ball joint boot, because as you can see there's no grease fitting, and I pumped these full of grease. The lower ball joint has a grease fitting. So I've got my bearings packed, inner one installed as well as the seal. I'm going to slide it up here, preload it, and give the rotor the final clean, slap the wheel on, and then I'll be ready for the other side. Now the way I like to preload them is spin the rotor while I tighten the nut down till I get it what I would consider pretty snug. You can start feeling that resistance on the rotor. And then I back it off a quarter to a half turn. Spin the rotor again. It should spin relatively easily like that. And there shouldn't be any slack in it. No slack. That's the way I do it. You do you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and knock out the other side. And while I'm doing that, go ahead and hit the like button. Then we'll take this thing for a rip. I've got the front end buttoned up. I thought we'd do a little autopsy on the suspect parts. We have the wheel bearings and the ball joint. The wheel bearing itself doesn't look that bad. I'm not seeing pitting in the rollers or discoloration from excessive heat. In fact, the outside bearing has a plastic cage. I don't think it's gotten all that hot. The cage does have, I think it's made that way. Just flat out here, the cage is flat, and up here it's more, I think it's made that way. But anyway, I'm not seeing any actual damage to the bearings. The grease itself it's funky. I mean, I'd almost call it dry. It does still have an oil film, but the oil content is just not what I would expect to see, and that's actually what provides the film of lubricant that the bearings ride on. So I don't know. I mean, the bearing itself feels good. I'll wash one and we'll take a closer look, and then I'm going to pop the boot off of this ball joint. It's not dry. You can see grease coming out from around here, but it is definitely a little bit floppy, and when you do force it a pretty good direction, it's got a choppy feeling to it. It's not smooth. So I'm going to pop this boot off and wash one of these bearings, and then we'll try to make our final determination. All right, with the bearing cleaned up, now I can see there is some clear discoloration on the rollers in the middle. I don't know if it'll come across on the camera. My lighting is very suspect as usual. Turn it the right angle, maybe you can see it. There's also scoring on the rollers. The scoring is more concentrated toward the inside of the taper. The discoloration's in the middle. I don't know. These things are tough, like I've been saying throughout the whole video, as far as pinpointing the culprit for the actual noise. Yes, there is some wear on this bearing, and it was probably a good idea to replace it. Was it the cause of the noise? It's hard to say. Let's look at the ball joint. It was not dry. I did wash the grease out of it so we could see the joint itself, but it had plenty of that gray, possibly like a moly grease. I'm not sure exactly what type of grease they had in there. Factory grease. And like the bearing, I'm seeing scoring. I don't know if it'll come across on the camera. I wish I knew, but maybe my narration will help you. There's scoring across the entire surface of this ball, and I'm sure it's not going to come up, but right at the tip of this screwdriver, there's actually a small flat spot, and there's multiple flat spots around the circumference of that joint. So, as we did suspect, it was due to be replaced. It's got 132,000 miles on it, something of that nature, and it was factory, 22 years old. So, my feelings aren't hurt at all. It was going to need to be replaced regardless. But again, it's not something I've seen so much more severe wear on ball joints. Go back and watch the video where I did the F550 project, and included in that was ball joints, and they were way worse than that. Of course, they were making noise, and it was obvious what the problem was. In my case, on the Gen 10 F150, we have noise. I have no idea what it is. This was a weenie down a hallway guess, and over the course of the entire front end, these are the only two components, the wheel bearings and ball joint, where I saw a potential for an issue. So they've now been replaced. Now we're going to put some miles on the truck and see if our noise is gone. And I want you guys in the comments to, where's your money at on the deal? You think it was the wheel bearings or the ball joint? Let me know. And the last thing I'll throw in here is I wanted to mention the type of grease I used. This is O'Reilly's house brand, the Master Pro, but it is designated high temp disc brake wheel bearing grease. Unlike the stuff I'd used before, now this is a number 2. Most of your automotive greases are a number 2. I don't know the weight of the base oil. I don't know if something in here would tell me that. It's a lithium complex EP grease. Anyway, what I'm getting at is all grease is not created equal. I've heard someone say, oh, grease is grease. No, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, there are more variations between greases than there are motor oils, transmission fluids, any type of fluid. Grease is super complicated, and it's deceptively so. A lot of people think it's just totally simple. But this is the grease I went with in the bearings, and I tell you what, it packed so good, and using a correct grease just makes me want to throw rocks at that old grease that I was using.
Get the rocks.
Yeah.
Abdul?
Yeah, get the rocks.
Get the rocks.
So that's just a reminder. It's always good to use the appropriate grease when you're doing any kind of work like this. So now we're going to jump in the truck, put a few miles on it. Well, if your money was on the wheel bearings or the ball joints, you'd be wrong. Because as you could hear, it is still making the noise, and it's louder than ever. One thing about me is I'm very stubborn. So I assure you, I will get to the bottom of this. But it'll have to be in the next video because this one's getting kind of girthy. So am I upset that I did all that work for nothing? Well, no, because it really wasn't for nothing. Those parts were going to need to be changed out soon anyway. And I know what would have happened because I know myself. I never would have inspected that ball joint or the wheel bearings absent this noise. And what would have happened was I would have waited until they were sure enough about to go out, and I would have needed the truck during that period, causing all kinds of problems. So I really did myself a favor. As George Costanza would say, for once my stupidity pays off. But in any regard, we're going to get to the bottom of it. It'll be in the next video, so be on the lookout for that. Until then, you guys take care.